thank you for coming back on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Cool. Well, for those of you who are listening, Amit has been on the show before, and we've actually covered this exact topic, but we wanted to do it again because we now have video component to this podcast, and some of you prefer the video, so this might be new for you guys. And if not, it stands to be talked about again because the topic is pricing a property for sale or pricing a listing, or how you're going to offer on a listing, what offer price you should pick. And it's important, obviously, because that will continue to perpetuate for the rest of real estate history. You will have to know how to price a place, and you will have to know how much you want to offer on a place. So we could talk about this every week, and it would probably be relevant every week. Anyway, thanks for coming back on, Amit. I really enjoyed our conversation the last time we talked. For those of you who did not listen, Amit's in Miami. He is a colleague with Compass, and he said some really enlightening things to me, which I have used in helping price my properties and work with my clients in the year since we recorded. So we'll go over some of that again. But yeah, so Amit, I mean, since we recorded last year, has anything really changed in how you tackle this?
Yeah, definitely. And I know like this is content that could be used for years, but we also have to be mindful of the time period that we're in, right? And with COVID, a lot of people, if they're not in real estate and they just read headlines and they know, they're outside of real estate, they may not exactly guess how the market is doing. So one of the things is to first get the expectations set up correctly. So I do that by doing two things. One is I'll Google search that person and I'll check and see where they're coming from, because our experiences are our experiences, right? We're not going to, if I live in the Bay Area and I'm used to homes selling for quite a bit over asking price, regardless of the market, that's my experience and that's what I know. So I find out where they're coming from. I do research on that real estate market so I can get an idea, because I don't know the country at all times. And then what I do is I ask the client a few questions. I ask them 4 questions about, first of all, I'll ask them their motivation for moving. It's COVID, things aren't the same.
Yeah.
And what is your motivation for moving right now? Then I ask them their expectations. What are your expectations with the move, like timelines and stuff like that? And probably price point. I ask them also like some of their disappointments that they've had in the past when they've gone through the process, and some of the complaints maybe that they've dealt with, like whether they did or a prior, like a friend or relative went through. And then I ask them about the market. What is their knowledge of their market? And I share with them. I know you've probably done this before, especially if they've told me that. But I wanted to make sure that your expectations are in line with how the offers are going and what sort of discounts or prices over asking they're going through. And I tell them I always want to make it as easy as possible. And I tell them I support your decision 100%. And regardless of what you say, whether this changes your mind from buying or selling now, it's okay. We're still going to be here in the future. We just try and set the stage up properly because it makes things a bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying as you were talking, I was thinking a lot of this feels like you're talking to a potential buyer, right? Somebody potentially who, it's buyers and sellers, but I was sitting here and thinking how I got a lead recently of somebody who owns a home in DC, but actually lives in San Francisco. And so it's like a family home that's here. So they don't really know this market and they're thinking about selling. So it's important to have that conversation regardless of it being a buyer or a seller, because they might not actually live in that house that they want to sell or even live in that jurisdiction. So they might need to, you really need to get a full picture of who this client is, regardless of which side of the transaction you're on. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, so well, that's amazing. I mean, it sounds like you guys do a major amount of due diligence and just figuring out who your clients are, which frankly, I feel like every agent should do, but you do it in a unique way. So then, I mean, maybe we can split it up a little bit as far as how you price a place for listing and then how you decide to price a place or sorry, offer on a place when you're buying. Which one do you want to tackle first?
We could talk about the listing side first.
Okay. Um, so listing side, I'm going to take something from I think verbatim said to me last time, which is that, which I actually have always done, but you look at selling and pricing a property and you look at it from the angle of a buyer. And that is the best advice and the most succinct advice I give my sellers when we first meet and talk about pricing, because I think it really sets you up as an agent and a client to understand that it's not personal for the seller or the agent, but that it's personal for the buyer, and that we need to put ourselves in their positions because they're ones eventually who are going to be offering on this home. So let's break it down a little bit for people who are considering selling their place and they have been looking at Zestimates and and things online that tell them how much their home is worth, and kind of go through it a little bit.
Yeah, so the first thing is typically a buyer is more familiar with the way the market is going than a seller is. A seller is typically just looking at maybe the Zestimate or whatever other website that gives a value of their market and maybe their neighborhood and properties that are selling there. The
Right.
problem is buyers aren't, when a buyer looks for a property, they're probably looking for certain things that make the area work for them. So maybe nice schools, maybe at least a 4 bedroom, 3 baths, a certain size yard, maybe in Miami a swimming pool, maybe a garage, maybe if it's in a condo, maybe a location that has walkability to certain areas and stuff like that. So what happens is when most buyers are looking, they look for multiple areas. They don't look for just one area. So the competition for the seller isn't just their neighborhood, it's other neighborhoods as well. So when you price a home, you have to pretend you're that buyer and look at, so if you have a home that's a 4.3 and a certain square footage and has nice schools, look at other areas that are maybe close by that would be your competition, because a lot of times when people are looking for areas, they may have your property in that search, and if it's priced too high, maybe it won't work because of that. And then a lot of times the seller will think, okay, my home is the least expensive property in my neighborhood. Why isn't it selling? And they have no clue that there were 5 other properties in a competing neighborhood that was just as good in a buyer's mind and are selling. So that would mean they probably need to sell 4 others first before yours sells, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
no, totally. I mean, this one comes up a lot for me. And actually, I have a bunch of buyers right now who are looking, and they're not even adjacent neighborhoods like what you're talking about. They're really all over the place because they have the limits that they're looking for are things like amount of light and the certain kind of outdoor space that they want and the level, as in like they don't want ground level, like they're things that are found throughout the city. They're not necessarily looking for certain schools or anything that's limiting them that way. And they truly are comparing multiple places in different neighborhoods with one another, and lots of buyers are doing that right now. It's not they're I mean, it's great for an agent when you have a client who just wants one neighborhood, because it's easy for you to compare, what you have, and where to draw the lines and everything. You don't feel like you're missing out on possible options for your clients. um, there are obviously there are downsides to it, but I mean, it's easier from a finding the listings from standpoint. But most people aren't doing that anymore. They're not just saying I want this one or two neighborhoods. So it's certainly, that's a huge thing to point out for people to understand and know.
Yeah, especially now in this market where we have very, very limited inventory, it
Yep.
sort of forces that to
Yep.
happen.
Yep. Yep. Totally. I mean, I was just on the phone with somebody before we were doing this recording saying that I was really disappointed that in the amount of inventory that we had in a specific subsection of the market that I thought was going to have more options available. Like here in DC, single family homes are, they've always been in short supply, so you're not as surprised when they go under contract quickly. But I was talking about a subsection of the condo market, and I was like, how is this happening? So yeah, I agree. I mean, you are forced. If you've decided you want to buy and you're not on the fence and you're like, I'm doing this, then yeah, you start considering what options you have, which are outside of maybe initially what you thought, and you start, broadening your options. Okay, so what's this number? Well, I don't know. We've probably said like 4 things at this point, but let's just say, what's our second main caveat with pricing a home for sale?
Yeah, so we want to look at like sometimes we actually price too low. If we're in an appreciating market and we look at the areas and we know things are going higher and there's very tight inventory, it depends on your time frame, right? When we ask a seller different questions, we ask them, what's your time frame? So a seller has like a longer time frame. They don't need to move for like maybe 4 or 5 months. You don't need to be the lowest priced property. You can be a little bit higher in an appreciating market, because once that property sells in a market, now when stuff sells quickly, you'll be the cheapest, and it'll give you a little bit more flexibility on the price. And obviously, if you're in a depreciating market, you want to be proactive on putting a lower price, because that could hurt you as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I know something we definitely talked about in the last time that you and I did an episode was about how sellers think that their homes are usually worth more than buyers do. And this one, this caveat to listing kind of makes me sad, because I don't like telling sellers that people don't value their things as much as they do, because it's not inherently like a nice, or like happy thing to tell people, but it's true. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, real estate's a business, and as agents, we're here to set our clients up for success. So, it's not personal, but it's true. There are people who redo their homes in very specific ways, or they get a designer, this, that, or the other thing, and they say, oh, well, it cost me $100,000 to do this bathroom. And that's great. And if it worked for them and they enjoyed that $100,000 bathroom, that's awesome. But it may not on the back end mean you get an extra $100,000 in the sale price. And that is a really big one that I see people struggle with a lot, is understanding value to them versus value to a buyer.
Yeah, totally. When our team will meet a seller and say their property is worth 800,000, they want to price it at 900,000. As agents, we're going to have those buyers, when we're showing the home and that agent is showing it to their buyers are looking for that extra 100,000 in value. So when we have a seller and we meet them, we'll be like, okay, the market value is 800. And if you could do me a favor, if you can point out those extra 100,000, I'll be happy. As agents, our goal is to support the sellers, but to also listen to them, because it's a team effort. It's not always the agent that knows 100% of the things. Since it's a seller's home, they may know about something that is worth more that we don't know about, that's not obvious to us. And so one of the questions we ask sellers is, when you move out of your house, besides that extra 100,000, to get more familiar with the house, when you move and you sell your home, what is something that you're going to miss the most about your house? So that's one of the questions. Another thing that we ask is, when you bought your house, after like the first 6 months, what did you discover in your home that you really fell in love with that you had no idea about? These emotional type questions, we have a bunch of them. We can create value and emotion with that next buyer. And sometimes we don't see these things. So yeah, a lot of times, just like you said, as a seller, we have all these memories in the home, and we remember about the barbecue or the time so-and-so did whatever they did that was awesome. and we have to always put our buyer's cap on. And it's very difficult to do that. But if we remember that, we're going to set ourselves up for the most success.
Yeah, and I think also like in the example of my $100,000 bathroom, sometimes things are not as obvious to the eye. Like, it could be that there's underfloor heating or something, and that it's an older home and it's going to get cold in the winter, and that's okay. Like people are used to it. That you might not see visually right away, right? And that might be huge. It's, pretty cold here in DC in the winter for some of those months. I would love to walk in and have toasty warm feet instead of my feet freezing on the tile. So yeah, there are definitely things that have value that will be realized by a buyer. But it's the job of the seller to tell the agent obviously to make sure that potential buyers know that information so that they can see that same value.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing to that. So it depends on the market we're in too, because like for example, when the inventory is tight and it's a huge seller's market, buyers are willing sometimes to pay over the appraised value. You have to figure out first two things. One, are most of the transactions cash or finance? So in Miami, 41% of all of our sales are cash. So 59% are finance. And out of those 59%, probably like a third are high down payments. So in this market, we can get someone to pay over the appraised value. But if we're not in that type of market where people are trying to pay appraised value, I can justify, if that seller can justify 100,000 to them, but if it's not going to appraise, I can get someone to sign a contract for whatever the amount is. But if we can't get to the finish line and close on the sale, we're actually taking the home off the market, and we're doing a disservice to that person. So we always have to be, I guess, aware of an idea of what the property will appraise for. And your agent, if they're a professional, they're going to be able to give you an idea of that. And then it's up to you to decide whether you're rolling the dice and hoping for someone to pay over appraised value, and you're okay with the timeline and losing time paying for your mortgage and all these other expenses, or you want to be, I don't know, be able to sell it in a better way, where you
Mhm.
save money.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, we're going to switch in a minute and go to kind of how you decide to put an offer price together, which, is a little bit different. But I want to cover one more thing with the sellers. Of course, all this stuff is related, right? Because we're talking about buyers and sellers, and you should honestly be thinking about the 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 standpoint of the other person when you're doing both of these kinds of things. But things that need to be thought about when pricing. So I'm going to use an example of something that's happened to me recently. There's a great condo in a neighborhood in DC that my client was very interested in. And we went to look at it and we started asking questions about pet policies and things that would be in the condo docs that we would eventually find out, but that of course you're going to ask before you put your earnest money deposit down and really go into it. And we found out that the building eliminated all rentals for buyers past, I don't know, 2018 or something like that. And so my buyer was like, oh, that, maybe not a big deal. And I stopped my buyer and said, if it's not, that's okay. That's up to you. But what that really means is if something happens in your life, you lose your job, you need to leave DC for whatever reason, you do not have that option to rent this place out. It is explicitly written here that you don't have that option. So it can sit and you can pay for it, or you can sell it. And so that's a big thing. That was a big thing to me. I mean, if I was buying, I would have said no immediately, because I just want the option to be able to rent it out if I have to. So when I said something to the listing agent, he said, well, it's a good policy for people who don't want tons of renters in the building. I said, yeah, but it doesn't protect those owners if something, God forbid, happens to them and they can't live there. It really can kind of work both ways. Um, and so we also spoke about the price, the listing agent and I said, you're priced high compared to the neighborhood. And he said, well, we're in line with comps. I thought to myself, well, the comps don't have a no rental policy. So people who are considering all of these other places, if they fall on hard times or whatever, and they just can't live there or don't want to live there, they can rent it out in these other places. So it's not directly a comp, in that way. And the question is really, what is that value? And then that's the issue. It's not like a parking space, which we can assess an approximate value for. What is that value of being able to rent if you need to? I don't have a number. But it's definitely something you need to consider when you're pricing because your buyers will be paying attention to that.
Yeah, totally. Because you're eliminating a huge pool of buyers, whether it's an investor, whether it's someone that wants to, is worried about their profession, their job, because they may have issues in the future and stuff like that. So with anything, if we're selling a product and we eliminate a huge pool of buyers, obviously that's going to affect the value. Just like if we can increase the pool of buyers, it's going to add value.
Yeah, and I mean, and I don't even mean it. And when I was thinking about it, it maybe is not totally obvious, but I know a lot of people who lost their jobs throughout the pandemic. People who, I don't know one person that I talk to who doesn't either directly know somebody or it's happened to them where you've lost their job or something that's happened or some personal circumstances has changed where you need to live. And so the last thing as a radical empath is what I call myself. The last thing I want to think for my buyer clients doing is going through some time that's stressful. And then on top of it, having to figure out a new housing situation. Like that just sounds like an emotional stress that nobody needs to go through. So anyway,
Totally.
yeah. So of course I can't put my feelings and thoughts onto my clients. Like everyone feels differently. But I just thought that could be a really rough position for my client to potentially be in with that purchase. Okay, so we're kind of going to end up saying a lot of the same stuff, so we can touch on it briefly. But when you're a buyer client and you're looking to put in an offer price and a bid on a place, let's talk about some of the caveats there really quickly and how people can do that.
Yeah. So once my buyers look at a property and they're ready to put in an offer, one of the steps a lot of agents don't do, a big misstep, is reach out to that agent and ask them questions. So the first question, I guess the only question would be, I'd say, hey, Allison, thanks so much for letting us see your place. Besides the price, are there any other things important to your seller?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And I shut up. And because a lot of times we think the sellers want to sell the place as soon as possible. They want to move as soon as possible. Maybe there are other things that they've experienced with their previous sales that are important to them. So that would be one of the things. The next thing would be to look at the market. Are we in an appreciating market? Or are we in a depreciating market? And if it's whatever the market is, I want to see the properties that sold. I want to figure out like the percentage of list price to the original list price to close price, approximately how long the properties have been on the market. And I can base it on that. If we get averages on that, it'll help us a whole lot, And I think what's even better is if we know that if I set the expectations right with my buyers before we even start looking and saying, okay, typically properties are selling in 23 days. They're selling for 10% over the asking price and whatever. Are you okay with this type of market? And I'm good either way. And if they know that up front, they know the market. When we put in an offer, it'll be much easier to do because it won't be like Allison is looking at a property and she doesn't know that she should be paying higher than asking price, 10% over. Otherwise, she won't get it. Otherwise, it's going to be like I'm the agent trying to push you in a place where you don't want to be. I'm like negotiating against you. I'm negotiating for the seller rather than the buyer.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the hardest thing with all of this, but in particular when with putting in an offer to purchase, is that typically is an emotional process for most people, with the exception sometimes of investors. Even that can be kind of emotional, but But so it's not totally rational all the time what people will go up to. Whereas people, so which is why my personal, my personal opinion about pricing is that you price it on like the lower to kind of medium side of things, because the market will push it up and people's emotions will push up a price. It's my opinion. But it is a risk, I guess. If it doesn't get pushed up, then ultimately people might not get the price that they want. But that's there's no, I should just time out right now and tell everybody there's no perfect any answer to any of this, by the way. We're just giving you our opinions on how we do it, that this is not a perfect science. If it was perfect, then you wouldn't have such vast negotiating that happens in real estate. But anyway, yeah, so I think the emotional component of buying is huge. Once you write a check and once you put an earnest money deposit or a photo, or you physically hand it to somebody, something clicks in a lot of people that makes them want to potentially change what they do. So as far as picking a price of what you're going to offer on, hopefully you're catching it before the emotions really start to churn and really start to get in there. But I've had people who will look at comps just in a building and say, well, the highest this one sold is this. And then I use the same argument that we use for how to price a place for sale, which is no one's looking in just that building. Like you guys are all, you're looking in different buildings. And so you can't choose your arguments depending on which side you're on. It works both ways. People are generally going to look all over the place or in the areas that they're interested in. And so you're comparing those as well when you're deciding how much to offer.
Yeah, and totally, like in this market, because we're in a market where people have to pay over what in the past was market value. I think it's very important to find out like how long the person is going to keep the property, because just like you said, as far as in the future, we care about our clients and we're looking at the future. If someone is only going to live in a property for a year or two, they need to know that there's a chance that they may not be in the best position in that time if they pay over market value now, and give them all the options that there may be, whether it's to rent or whether it's, whatever, just to rethink things. The last thing we want to do, like you said, Allison, is get that call later and not have set them up, for the future success. Whereas your other example, you said like with that building where you can't rent it, if something happens horrible in that person's life and they lose their job and they have to sell, the last thing we want to tell them at that point is, hey, your property is worth less because the person is, you can't rent it, so we lose a pool of buyers. You want to always set them up for what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, I mean, as we kind of come to a close here, I'll say that what I probably have already said like 10 times, but which is that both sides need to be thinking about when they're on the other side and how they would feel and what they would maybe want to do. When I have a buyer right now, we're getting ready to put an offer in, and she's talking about changing some things and how it might, how that would be good for her. And I'm saying, okay, when you go to resell, which might be in 3 to 5 years, to sell it, then you're going to have to probably put these things back because it's not going to increase the value. It might actually hurt you, like opening up a wall and making it from going to a 2-bedroom to a large 1-bedroom. That might hurt you when you go to sell. And that's okay. I always tell them that's okay for you to do these things and consider them. But think about how that might affect you in the future and how that might affect you over the course of when you own, so that you might have to put that wall back up before you sell or whatever. So that, I'm setting that buyer up in that way to say, do what you want, but know that this is how it might affect you in the future. Because I don't know about you in Miami, but very few people buy a home here and stay here forever, especially within the city, because it's just, there's limited inventory. It's not big. If people want, more stuff, then you end up moving somewhere else. And so anyway, so I think that that's like the main takeaway here is you have to look at everything from a strategic long-term standpoint and from the other side of where you're at.
Totally.
Well, it's thank you so much for coming on and talking about this with me again on video this time. Obviously, if people are interested in doing any of these things, and they should reach out to their agent to help them really strategically formulate either how to price their listing or their offer price when they're going to buy. If I ever get any people in the DC market who want to move to Miami, you're my guy. I will make sure to
Thank
send
you.
them your way. And thanks again for coming on. It's good to see you.
My pleasure. Likewise.